15 on the clock. Zeppelin Ronig gets the under. 10 seconds. Spencer Lofink puts it on a rope. Tommy Lee connects. Wow, Seattle goes up top with 5 seconds remaining. Woo!
Salvage the clock finish if they need it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. The crowd is loving it.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass Week 10 recap action coming at you. Another wild weekend from the UFA regular season. Not quite the results we were expecting, but still another thrilling weekend within the association. I am Adam Ruffner, joined as always by Cameron Brock. We've got 8 clinched playoff teams for the 2024 UFA postseason. Minnesota in the Central, DC, Boston, and New York clinching up all 3 seeds in the East Division. Atlanta and Carolina punching their playoff tickets in the South. And Seattle, for the first time since 2016, making their return to the postseason with their big win over Colorado. And Salt Lake, despite their misstep in New York, also punching their playoff ticket for the 3rd straight season. There are 4 playoff spots remaining between the 4 main divisions, but as I mentioned a moment ago, the East is all locked up, but the Central, South, and West are still up for contention for their seeds. I know you guys in Indianapolis are battling your hearts out. You got a hard-fought win at home over Madison. Elsewhere in the league, DC and New York proving to be the beasts of the East in their 2 showcase matchups. The Breeze taking care of the Flyers 25-13. And I would say being one of the most surprising results we've seen not only this season, but in the past few. Again, the Flyers were 6-0 before week 9 started. They've now lost 2 in a row by a combined almost 25 goals at this point. So just a tough time for a team that we thought as being the pristine class of the 2024 season. And similarly, Salt Lake, you know, they've been a premier team in this league the past 2 seasons. And yet that setback against the Empire, going 10 of 37 on their offensive possessions against the New York defense, really puts them back in that headspace that they were trying to recover from after last year's championship game meeting with the Empire. Cam, I know you've got thoughts about your game, probably top of mind, but where else do you go right now after this week 10 slate of results that feels both a little bit understandable, but I think just still has a lot of quirks to it? Again, we haven't even gotten to Oakland's missteps in Southern California. The Spiders entered the weekend 5-2 in very secure place of 3rd place within the West Division, but they go ahead and drop a game on Saturday night in San Diego before going to LA on Sunday and dropping that one as well. They sit at 5-4. They've kept the back door open for both Colorado and San Diego to possibly do some standings magic to work their way back into a playoff scenario. There's just kind of a lot of things to pay attention to. Austin, by not winning their game against Atlanta, still keeps a backdoor open for the Havoc, who would need a real Hail Mary to reach the playoffs at this point. But there's still just so many scenarios. I've been pulled into a handful of god-awful tiebreaker conversations on the side over the past couple days about what would happen should Chicago, Madison, Indianapolis, and Pittsburgh engage in some kind of 4-way, unforeseen to this point in the league's history tie. Like, to get back to my point, there's sort of the things that we know, which are the 8 clinch playoff teams, and then there's just a host of things that we still have to figure out.
Yeah, going down the rabbit hole of the central playoff picture right now is, I would say, akin to Abed trying to figure out if Nicolas Cage is a good actor or a bad actor in Community. Like, it's just going to drive you insane.
I'm right there with you. I hope our fans are also fellow Community heads, but
if you aren't, do yourself a favor. Go watch it. 6 seasons in a movie.
Okay, but really only the first 3 seasons. The back 3 aren't worth it so much, in my opinion. Love the first 3 seminal seasons, but
For real. But I think like coming out of this weekend, like going into this weekend, right? There was like a lot of matchups to be excited about, and it's funny because we talked kind of about what we thought was going to happen going into the weekend, and I was pretty adamant that I thought Oakland was going to win both games. And after they dropped the San Diego game, I thought, well, okay, in San Diego's been playing a lot of teams tough all year, understandable loss. And I thought for sure they would rebound on Sunday. And boy, did they not. Not even close. Like this isn't even like, they were down the whole game, and it wasn't like they were in it or had a lead and blew it. I mean, they were just down from the get-go, and I couldn't have been more shocked.
They trailed in both games wire to wire.
Yeah. And it's just so unexpected for a team. It's hard to say. Is it unexpected? Because like last year they did something similar, but I really thought that they had kind of grown up out of the things we saw happen last year. And because I think for the most part this year they have proven that in a lot of ways they have grown up and as ultimate players. And it just seemed they just had a complete collapse in both games. And credit to San Diego and LA. Like I don't want to take anything away from them because especially an LA team that's really had trouble finding its footing this year. They're down Brandon Van Dusen, who has been so integral to their offense for the last couple years.
Second leading completions person in the entire league last year to fellow teammate Pavel Giannis, who is establishing a kind of completions gap between him and second place that I feel like you and your current all-time goals lead can appreciate, where it's just you're getting a little too far away from the standard deviation of where everyone else has existed in this league.
It's kind of like when he's also the assist leader, of course, this ties in perfectly. It's like when you look at the all-time assist record in the NBA and you see John Stockton like thousands and thousands ahead of everyone else. I don't know. That was like, it's funny because every day there was of the like all 3 days, right? Friday, Saturday, Sunday, there was something on each day that just caught me so off guard. And I don't think there's ever, I'd put money on it right now. There's never been shocking results on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday in our league's history the way we saw this weekend. Like with the Carolina loss in the DC dominance in that game on Friday, with Salt Lake absolutely not even showing up. It looked like they forgot. Like had I not been watching the game, I would have thought that they picked up 20 guys off the street in Hartford to fill in their lineup the way they were playing. And then on Sunday, Oakland completing the double dip the wrong way by losing both games the way that they did.
Let's also talk about Seattle a bit here too, and we'll get to them a little bit later on in the pod. But I mean, they go up 7-2, 8-2 to begin the game on Colorado. Look like they're going to cruise. Yep. And then the Summit just keep punching back as they have on the road all season. Despite them being lower in the standings, the Summit team has shown a heart of resilience throughout the 2024 season. They punch back. They take a fourth quarter lead. And then were it not for just some absolute firecracker highlight plays by the home team Cascades down the stretch being fueled by a big home crowd, I don't know that Seattle comes out with that W, but Tommy Lee comes away with the layout goal in the waning moments of regulation, punching Seattle's first playoff ticket in 8 years. They come up with a big win. I would also add that to the list, just as far as that win coupled with the Salt Lake loss now puts the Cascades in first place in the West Division heading into July, which, again, what would you... I'm not a betting person, and so you can't ever ask me what are the odds, but what are the odds that you would have put this Seattle team in first place atop the West at this point in the season?
Pretty distant. And that's less about Seattle and more about Salt Lake and just where we saw them, I guess.
In Colorado and LA.
Yeah, we talked about on the preview pod, like, it's not like super shocking on a game-to-game basis that they've won those 8 games. Like, maybe you would have asked me before the season if they were going to beat Colorado, I might have given them a shot at home. So I guess that isn't the most shocking. But I think the more shocking thing is that they've been able to win 8 games. Like, I think all of those games before the season, I always said, yeah, they would have a chance. Like, I would give them a fighting chance, and in some of them, I would favor them. But for them to actually do it throughout the whole season and actually go win all those games for a team who hasn't been over 500 and, since like 2017, 2016, like, I don't know if I would have said that.
Here's the stat. If you add up the past 4 regular seasons for the Cascades, how many wins do you think you would get?
Oh, gosh. Okay. I'm going to
I'll
say
end your
the
struggling.
past 4, I'm going to say they have 6 wins.
11.
Okay, I was way off. Okay, I thought it was going to be way worse. Okay,
No,
but 11,
but
so that's like what, 3 or less, like that's less than 3 a season, right? So
yeah, almost. Yeah, on average, just a little bit below 4. You can take any 2 seasons and add them together since 2017-18. So any of the next 5 years, add them together, you would not approach the 8 wins that they got this year.
wild.
To give you a context of the kind of turnaround that the Cascades have had in 2024.
Yeah, it's funny because like I made all these bold predictions before the weekend, and obviously some of the New York one panned out. The Carolina one definitely did not pan out. The Seattle one panned out, like, but it was just like the ones that didn't pan out really didn't pan out. Like Oakland going 2-0, nope, they win straight 0-2, and I think that was just like it was just so crazy. And maybe Friday night's game with Carolina DC should have been the precursor. We knew that like this wasn't going to be your normal weekend of Frisbee, because that to me, Salt Lake got kicked around by New York. That was way less shocking to me than what we saw Friday night with Carolina, because Carolina, yeah, like Atlanta, like handled them pretty well a couple weeks ago, but like we think Atlanta is probably the best team in the league. So like for them to go into Atlanta's got their full 20, and they've been playing great, and they've been tested by all these tough games. Like that was a result that made sense to me, and it didn't really make me think less of Carolina. It just made me think higher of Atlanta. Whereas this game, Carolina goes in and they look sort of kind of how I would describe Salt Lake looking right now. It looks like they peaked early and like something has changed. I don't know. I can't put my finger on it, but like there is something going on clearly. And like credit to DC Breeze, like they played a great game, but when a team as good and talented as Carolina gets destroyed like that, you can't give all the credit to the team doing the destroying, because there is clearly something going on with that Carolina team. I mean, shoot, they went to Pittsburgh the next day, and I think most people, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here to say that most people would, favor Carolina pretty heavily in that game. And they only had a 1-goal lead at halftime. Looked like they might, have another game on their hands there that they might be losing. So I just don't know what to think about Carolina right now. Them and Salt Lake both seem so out of sorts, but like with Salt Lake, I feel like I can see reasons why, like Will Selfridge being out of the lineup, Jordan Kerr having to play essentially one-handed, like some injury things are happening there. Like that makes sense to me. Like with Carolina, it doesn't, I don't know what to put my finger on.
So let's do the autopsy then of the 2 big games. The game of the week, which was Carolina, DC on Friday night, and then the Super Series matchup on Saturday between Salt Lake and New York. Obviously, we'll start with the Friday night matchup that you were most referencing before. DC absolutely crushing Carolina 25-13. I mean, this thing was almost a laugher by 5 minutes left in the third quarter. I think Breeze had started to double up the Flyers, which I don't think it's, unnatural to say that the Breeze beating Carolina would be shocking given how these two teams have played and given the relative power of these two franchises. But doubling up in either direction, I think, is approaching a kind of unfathomable territory, as you're talking about. The truly amazing stats from this game. DC, I think the headline item we talked about in the pre-show, DC's defense, 14 of 15 on defensive break opportunities.
Insane.
That, to me, is the most dominating break score performance of the entire season. Regardless of opponent, if you're doing 14 of 15 on defensive break opportunities, that's the kind of thing that Minnesota gets against Detroit in a lot of matchups, let alone DC versus a potential championship contender in Carolina. So, to your point, it's both an indication that DC's defense was just so good attacking in transition. I think immediately of that AJ Merriman throw early in the game to Miles Grovic, when Miles Grovic is about 3 to 5 yards behind Jacob Fairfax when the throw goes up, and Merriman knows his receivers so well to just do a throw to the future to exactly where he needs to be, where Fairfax just gives up on it, given the angle and velocity of the throw. Just a perfect counterattack play from the DC defense. But it was all night long. It was both the Breeze's ability to attack and maintain possessions, but in turn, it was also this Carolina offense that for the first time all season, and even against Atlanta, I don't feel like this was as prevalent. They were giving up the short field turnovers that have become an absolutely killing blow to any team's successes this season. I mean, I think in most recent weeks, we've seen it play out in Chicago. Sorry, not to bring up any too recent memories for you, but their stadium has really affected some short field turnovers that can flummox both the Union themselves at home and also visiting teams. This DC game reminded me a little bit of that, where there was just times where the Flyers felt like they couldn't complete a pass in the first 3 possessions of a given point, which where this team started this year, to your point earlier again, is like totally baffling. Like I don't entirely understand what I saw from Carolina on Friday night, and I know that they got it back together on Saturday, getting a 9-goal win at Pittsburgh. But, I mean, you just look through some of these stats. The 23 turnovers for the Flyers, it equals the previous weekend against the Hustle. Back-to-back games of 23 turnovers for a Flyers team that before Week 9 was top 4 in the league in fewest turnovers per game. Going back into this franchise's history, you have to go back to 2018 to find the last time they turned a disc over more than 22 in a given matchup. And they did that in back-to-back games against the kind of competition that they really need to prove themselves against. And just looking at how they're playing right now, the Flyers continuation game, which has been the bread and butter of both their, I think, more conservative approach that can always get open front of stack with Laviolette and Jungst, and then rely on a Fairfax or somebody else to open up top deep, whether it be Dylan Hawkins or Trevor Lynch or somebody else. There's sort of 1-2 combination of getting the disc out of the backfield and then into a capable thrower's hand who knows the exact timing of who's releasing off of them downfield has been so scintillating. And that was just non-existent in this game against DC. They just could not get it going. And it was sort of the same story the weekend before against Atlanta, where all of a sudden this high-octane, up-tempo Flyers offense just kind of died on the vine.
The thing that's probably the most damning for this team right now too is that the players that we have kind of really been gassing up that have been playing so well all year have been kind of at the forefront of these like last 2 losses. And
to your point, Fairfax, Laviolette, and Jungst against DC combined for 7 throwaways. I think they had 7 throwaways combined in their first 5 games.
Well, and that's what I was about to get to. So Jungst in the last 3 games has 5 throwaways to just 2 the entire rest of the season. He's got 2.5 times more throwaways over the last 3 games than he did the first 5. You look at Alan Laviolette, he has 10 throwaways in the last 4 games. He only had 2 in the first 4 games. It's just like, Jacob Fairfax. He had as many throwaways this weekend as he's had the whole season leading up to this point. Trevor Lynch had he had 6 throwaways combined this weekend in their 2 games. he only had 5 throwaways the whole rest of the season. I mean, this is like, these are some of the most important players, some of the players that they've been counting on to take care of the disc all year. Some guys that have been potential MVP candidates, as we've talked about earlier in the season. And these are the people who are turning over the disc.
It's just really interesting how quickly these offensive units can sort of find arrhythmia. I feel like we most noticeably experienced it as well in the Super Series matchup with Salt Lake. I mean, they had a historically bad offensive performance, but to your point, I mean, the Flyers, they converted on 38% of their offensive possessions in DC. That again, you're going to have to go back years to find a similar performance from this team. Like, this is not something that this franchise is accustomed to whatsoever. And it just is such a startling result that it really introduces a host of questions that we previously didn't have about the Carolina Flyers. And I think I kind of want to also transition now into what happened between Salt Lake and New York, because I think it's a very similar presentation and we can kind of bound these together a bit. Of absolutely, you need to give credit to the 2-time reigning champion Empire, their defensive pressure. Marquez Brownlee absolutely going off against the Salt Lake offense. I mean, starting the game with basically a step through interception in the lane and then just being a presence for that D-line all matchup long. He's launching pulls, he's throwing assists, he's just kind of doing everything for this Empire defense that was down John Randolph and experienced no trepidation as a result of that because of how well everyone else stepped into their roles. But on the flip side of this, you have a shred team that, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, went 10 of 37 on offensive possessions, 27% offensive success rate. Their second lowest result of the season is 54%. They almost undersold that by a half. They had 27 total turnovers, and they just, from the get-go of the game, looked like they were sleepwalking a little bit. And they couldn't stop the short field turnovers. They couldn't get a rhythm going. And there's just this way in which, whether it's the new pulling rules, whether it's the new Frisbee, whether it's some mitigating factor, there are these ways in which normally robust, consistent offenses can just fall apart right now in the 2024 season.
Can old man Cam yell at some kids to get off his lawn real quick? Because I need to. And you talked about the polling rules, and that's all right. Salt Lake, I've got some advice for you. Did you know that you can actually step out of bounds as the poll's coming in to stop it from rolling? Did you know? Because here's what I saw. 5 or 6 polls in a row when New York was pulling downwind, which I believe was to the left end zone as you're watching the stream. I would see a Salt Lake player go all the way to the back because Marquez Brownlee's polls were landing super blady, and they were landing right inside the back of the end zone, within 2 to 3 yards or less, that's a tough pull to field, right? You're not going to catch it because it seems super risky with the angle it's coming in at. It's windy. I'm sure it's kind of moving a little bit. And I would continually see the Salt Lake, whoever was fielding the pole, they would stand and let it bounce sideways and let it bounce in front of them and just roll at the back. The fact that no one figured out hey, why don't I just go out of bounds, behind the end zone where the disc is going to hit and roll to, and that way I can field it, after it's hit the ground, I can just, stop it behind the end zone and get it in faster. Instead, they're wasting 2, 3, 4 more seconds getting the disc, and then New York's on them. And it's just good luck starting your offense literally from the back line with New York breathing down your neck. I saw that happen so many times, and that's a coaching error. That's a coaching error. And, we've talked a lot about how much we love what Bryce Merrill's done out there and the culture he's built and some of the things he's not afraid to do, not afraid to say. But to me, that's a coaching error. You got to get your guys to know how to field a pull when it's on the back line. You need to be able to get out of bounds, stop it faster, and get that disc moving. And they were just at such a disadvantage so often when they were receiving in that side of the end zone. And New York just didn't have those same problems. You're already struggling you need to find ways to manufacture success. You need to find ways to kind of artificially like make up for some of the deficiencies you have when you're struggling like that. And one of the easiest things you can do is control things like that, where you're just positioning to get the pull. And they just failed to do that over and over again. And credit to New York, because they were able to just kind of pounce on them consistently and give them no space to work with.
Well, in Salt Lake, we've talked about this extensively, is one of the best red zone teams over the past 2 seasons. They love that area of the field. They only get 13 opportunities against the Empire. It's their second lowest even attempt number of the season. And they convert just 9 of them, underneath 70% for the game. And it just speaks to your point of there was just a lack of focus that made this Shred team look completely unlike themselves in this matchup against the Empire, whether it came from sort of coaching and strategy and preparation and also just execution. Because one of my takeaways from the game was that with Jordan Kerr and damaged wing and sort of, I think, early game tentativeness about going up against a defensive opponent that featured the guy and Antoine Davis, who sort of shut him down in their 2 matchups in 2023. And then Grant Lindsley, their other kind of captain, who I think a lot of the team feeds off of in big games to sort of have big performances, as he did last year in the semifinals, being such a backbone piece of their tough fought win against Minnesota. And then even in the championship game, kind of being somebody who's digging out important possessions for them. He finished tied for a game high in throwaways with 5 and could just never really get into rhythm. And without those 2 leaders leading the charge for the Shred, there was no one else to really take that mantle for me. And it's been one of my concerns for Salt Lake, given the fact that Will Selfridge hasn't played now in 4 straight games, 5 straight games, given the fact that they lost Joel Clutton over the offseason. You know, there wasn't a whole bunch of bulwark to support this relatively inexperienced Shred team should their star performers start to falter a bit. And this New York crushing win over them really solidified that point in my head that, like, who else is going to be the finisher? Who's going to be the kind of closer for the Salt Lake team to step up when maybe things aren't operating at optimal levels, when there isn't sort of this finesse approach and everyone's getting into rhythm? Who's going to be the person in a rock fight to simply gut it out, get in the trenches, make stuff happen for them? And there was just no aspect of that for this Salt Lake team in this matchup. And on the flip side, you have an Empire team dealing with a fair amount of absences in their own right, yet they're getting good performances from those plug-in players. Matt Labar has a fantastic game stepping in ostensibly in his offensive role, for his defensive role, with John Randolph being out of the lineup. You had Sam Alston making a play. You had Sam Jonas making a play. There's an ability for this New York team suddenly, despite having a little bit of a depreciated level of star in talent, to still be the disciplined team that's won 2 straight titles.
Jordan Kerr only touched the disc 13 times the entire game. 13! And for some people, that's an acceptable number. Jordan Kerr's previous low was 24, nearly double that in that big 25-19 win at Oakland. And that's like one of those games where, well, he only had 24 touches because they were playing a lot of defense. Like, they were breaking Oakland. And I said it last week, like, their offense, there's nothing special they do. Like, I don't think there's anything that they do strategically on offense that, like, other teams can't do. Their offense is so good because of the motor, which is Jordan Kerr. And we have seen 3 times now with Antoine Davis on Jordan Kerr and his touches becoming limited as a result of that, because he just can't get open in space upfield, or at least they can't find him in the space upfield. You know, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell in the stream, like, everything that's happening upfield, because you just can't see everything that's going on in the cutting space. But very clearly, when Jordan Kerr cannot have his hands on the disc 25 plus times like he does in every other game, they struggle. Like, they cannot function as an offense. And I think that's just what we saw here. He doesn't get the disc, they struggle. And it's kind of end of story right there. And they got to find ways. They got to be more creative, honestly. I think, like, we've seen 3 times now, like, you can't just go put Jordan Kerr out in the cutting space against Antoine Davis. It's just not going to work. So you got to find other ways to manufacture touches for him, whether that's maybe starting him in the backfield more, like getting him into a space where he can get his hands on the disc more. Because I would love to see them start with him, like, maybe not with the cast on his hand. I wouldn't necessarily want him catching poles, especially the way they come in with sharp angles, but maybe he is the person you center to just so he can get his hands on the disc. And that can also create easier cutting opportunities for him, because when you're dishing the disc off to somebody and then you have all that space in front of you to work with, instead of being upfield already where you're a little more limited with like what parts of the field you can go to, that's a way to manufacture and create more touches for him. Like, but we haven't seen that adjustment. We've just continued to see Salt Lake bash their head against the wall and just try to run their system the way they run against every other team. But it clearly doesn't work against New York because Jordan Kerr can't get the disc in his hands. So I think, if they're lucky enough to make it a championship weekend, and if New York is there too, and they find themselves in another matchup with them, they need to make some sort of adjustment to get Kerr the disc in his hands, because when he doesn't, they just don't have what it takes to overcome that. At least they haven't shown so far in their 3 years that they can.
Lucky enough to make championship weekend.
Yeah,
I mean,
right
I
now
don't
they look
disagree with you.
clearly
Given
like the
that
second best team, or not the top team in that division, I would say right now.
I mean, I would hold off on that a little bit. The West has been so chaotic, and Salt Lake has taken care of business against every other team that wasn't Colorado, who has a specific kind of leverage point against this shred roster. But I don't disagree with what you're saying. I just think it's really interesting how you encapsulated that. And to dovetail off your point about maybe getting Kerr earlier involved in Salt Lake offensive possessions, I concur. I think that he's such a good distributor, and he's so good at locomotion. He's so good at getting things established with his legs in that kind of space that I think he can find himself running into favorable throwing positions. And that Salt Lake handler unit in general is very good at cycling and being mobile. They don't necessarily stay in a static formation and just let them linger in the backfield. Sean Cannell, Jake Miller are all very good at getting downfield and making themselves into kind of activated receivers if they have a favorable matchup. So I agree. I think that there could be a pretty good amount of purchase if this Salt Lake team can maybe get a few more touches out of Jordan Kerr earlier. I just think that given where he's coming from with this injury, then you need to sort of also keep in mind workload management and not expecting him to do too much out there with, again, a mitigated playing standard, given that he has a broken pinky finger on his right non-throwing hand. But I think it's something to consider because, again, they're starting to slip a little bit. And this is a good point into transition, I feel, into, well, no, I'm sorry. We'll get to Seattle in a second. I want to flip over to both New York and DC, because DC dropped their game to begin the season at Salt Lake. They fought very valiantly on the road. They came into the season with a lot of, I think, understated turnover in their roster. Obviously, with Daryl Stanley, who had been their coach since 2016, 2017 for the DC franchise, being replaced by Lauren Boyle after Stanley's retirement. There's just a lot of moving pieces. And so I think DC starting 0-1 sort of put us in a position where we maybe weren't evaluating them in a completely clear-headed space. But given them having a 12-goal win over Carolina, and now also with New York establishing themselves as a dominant force, getting up off of the mat after being 4-3 just a couple weeks ago, now sitting at 7-3 and looking more and more every week like the reigning champions. This East Division, man, like, I just kind of wanted to stop for a second and take a little bit of a gander at what's going on there, because DC is now 9-2. They sit currently in the 1 seed. Boston is just a step behind them, having played a couple fewer games, so that's a main reason why they currently trail them in the standings. But then you have New York, who, as we talked about in the preview pod for week 10 at the end of last week, was one of those teams who it's felt like now a couple of squads within the UA almost had a duty for the other teams to sort of put this team down, to drive the win stake through their heart, and nobody can quite do it. And now with this huge win over the team that they faced in the championship game last year, I'm just starting to get back to that point where it feels a little bit like the old Tim Duncan Spurs or something, where it's like they're not dead until somebody's singing their 6 inches of dirt in between them and surface air. Like, they need to be absolutely thwarted until I don't believe in this New York team anymore.
Yeah, and it looks so different than it did last year, right? Like they struggled with the huck in this game, just like they kind of have all year, which is, something that they were so proficient at over the last few seasons. But it just works. The defensive pressure was there. They did this even without John Randolph, who is, you could make an argument as their best player. Definitely
I
one
was
of their
making
top.
quasi arguments about him being their best player coming into this season.
I mean, he's amazing, and it didn't matter. I've said it numerous times now, but the adversity that they've had to fight through this season to be where they're at, I think, is what makes them such a scary team. Because if there was a team in the league that we would almost, I don't want to say give a pass to, but we would completely understand if they looked, if they just didn't live up to the expectations of last season, it was New York. With the players they lost, with the tough start with the first 2 games and how bad the offense looked, it would have been you know what? Yeah, they just lost 2 MVPs. And they're all a year older, and you could go down the list and just be okay, it was a good run. But that's not what they've done. They after those first 2 weeks, I believe they had a week off, and I think that week off probably did them a lot of good, because since then they have started to look like the New York Empire again. They take care of the disc, they make all the right decisions. Their defense, which has started kind of slow even after those first couple weeks, wasn't quite still the defense that we had seen over the last couple of seasons, is starting to really round into form and remind us a lot of the defense that we've seen over the last couple of seasons. I mean, they're scary. I know 7-3, when you go compare with records across the league, is not gonna blow you away. But when you really look at what they've done, you really watch the games they've played in, and you see the way that they're kind of powering up as the season goes on. I mean, they're still, I think, locked in the top few teams of this league right now. And they are absolutely on a very short list of teams I would least want to have to play right now.
They've got 30 turnovers total in their last 3 games combined. In each of those matchups as well, they've converted on 67% or better of their offensive possessions in each of those matchups. Their defense is also converting at around 65-70% in their last 3 games. And take that with a grain of salt too. The matchups are against Toronto and Philadelphia, who have struggled to get wins in this season. But to your point, New York is getting up off of the mat, and that should absolutely terrify everyone in this entire league. And on the flip side too, you've got this DC team that's got to win against New York, and will face them in the final weekend of the regular season on July 20th, just 19 days from when we're recording this, potentially for a home game absolutely in the playoffs, if not for the overall number 1 seed, in what will be, I think, at that point, again, an absolute must-watch matchup between these East Division Titans. And it's just, I don't know, man. It's tough to keep Boston in perspective in the East sort of melee, given how this Breeze and this Empire team came out of week 10. These are the 2 teams that have dominated this division over the past few seasons. Yet Boston has the most recent victories against either squad and has the reigning MVP and still has a team that is just vice gripping out opponents at this point, both offensively without making mistakes and then defensively being able to frustrate teams individually on their matchups and then convert breaks at a very good clip. Like, this East Division playoff bracket is shaping up to be something else and kind of its own championship weekend series of games.
Yeah, and it's really hard because like Boston had all of they don't have any out of division games, and all of their matchups against DC and New York are over now. So like they're just playing the lower half of that division until their regular season's over. So it is going to be hard to keep them in perspective, because even if they're taking care of business in those games, it's like, well, yeah, you should. You're the better team. More than likely they're going to end up in the 1 seed, because if they control their destiny, if they win out, they will be the 1 seed. And I fully expect them to. It's hard to say it's a concern. My only concern for them would be like they're going to have gone, like, by the time if they do get the 1 seed, by the time they host that playoff game, it's going to have been like 2 months since they played a team with a winning record. And that's like, you take it how you will, right? Like, on one hand, you could say, well, they took care of business and that's great. But on the other hand, like, you haven't continued to be battle tested throughout the season. And could that sneak up on you when whoever's coming in to play you is just going to recently play? I mean, because what's going to happen, and most likely, is that DC and New York are going to play each other final week of the season, and they're going to play each other again first round of the playoffs. Like, they're definitely going to be battle tested, whoever wins going into that Boston game. And I do worry for Boston a little bit, just like, do you lose your competitive edge a little bit when you haven't played somebody that's closer to your level in that period of time?
Well, in battle testing, I feel like is one of the most important sort of phrases to use within this league right now. It is the way in which Atlanta came into the season wanting to construct their entire schedule. It is, I think, something that's been prominent within DC, New York, Carolina schedules throughout the past couple of years. You talk about championship contenders, like having the right amount of challenges and obstacles within your regular season before you get into your playoff competition is super important. I'm even thinking back because, I live in the city, Madison in 2018, they have a mid-season fumble against the Flyers. They lose against you guys in Indianapolis at Grand Park indoors. They sort of headed into the playoffs, I think, with a fair amount of questions, yet they rallied and responded off of those challenges and used them as coal in the furnace to really motivate themselves towards a championship. And I just see so much of that this season throughout all 4 divisions, where it's which team is really setting up their schedule to make sure that they're getting good check-ins with quality competition so that they don't have some kind of backpedal. I mean, and we'll talk about this in a second when we talk a little bit more about the Spiders, but like that's sort of the problem with Oakland, is that they get these, I think now in retrospect, kind of conspicuous wins against quality opponents, but that are in sort of unfortunate or disadvantaged situations, which are huge boons for Oakland when they get to take advantage of that at home in specific, but don't necessarily hold a bunch of weight over time. And I think that is something to keep an eye on, especially with your point of Boston, is that, yeah, they got those wins against DC and New York in June. Is that going to hold up into August or late July? Who knows? That's a number of weeks. I mean, we talk about the turnaround that New York has had since week 2, week 3, when they lost by 5 goals on the road at Atlanta. That looks like a completely different squad now several weeks later to what we're seeing with the Empire. That's a similar amount of time that will progress between essentially now or the last couple of weeks and when the postseason starts, or when these teams will be playing in divisional championships.
We just have to wait and find out.
We're gonna have to wait and find out. But to that point, I think we should get into the rest of the games, and I think most notably to Seattle, because That is a franchise that I think has existed with a bedrock of talent for a very long time. We've talked about them over the past couple of seasons as being one of the most entertaining watches on the broadcast platform. And now finally, after their 20-19 thrilling seesaw win against the Summit at home, the Cascades are returning to the playoffs for the first time since 2016. And it just couldn't have come, I think, in a more fitting fashion for Seattle. You go and you look at the final stats, offenses in this game absolutely struggled. But perplexingly, Seattle still finished with only 16 total turnovers. They had nearly as many blocks with 13. Their defense was an astounding 11 of 13 on break opportunities. And as a team on the whole, they were a perfect 15 of 15 on their red zone attempts. So I think overall, a very satisfying win, obviously, given how it ended with the Tommy Lee layout and having it be at home and everything. But Seattle went up 7-2, 8-2 by the beginning of the second quarter on Colorado and allowed the Summit back into it by the second half. They then took another 4-goal lead later in the game, allowed Colorado to rally back and even take a fourth quarter lead at a certain point. This Seattle team, for all of its top-end talent, for Khalif El-Salam showing up and showing his superstar level that he can elevate to, Tommy Lee again coming up with one of the clutchest grabs in its franchise's history, just a lot of impressive individual performances. I've still got so many questions about where is the give line for this Cascades team, and in general, given the results of the various West Division contenders after this past weekend, what is sort of the floor of any team within that division? What is the possibility for any team to sort of rise up over the melee that we've been seeing in the West in 2024?
Well, I guess I would say the floor for Seattle is pretty high because their 2 losses are, I believe, are by a combined 3 goals, if I'm not wrong.
No, not Seattle. They lost their first game by 14. Sorry. I am flipping that with San Diego. No,
They
you're
lost
completely
at
right.
Colorado by 2, right?
They lost at Colorado by 4.
By 4, okay. So they have 2 losses by a combined 5 goals. Their loss by 4 to Colorado was Colorado's first game of the season where they had their full roster, and Seattle was on the second day of a back-to-back. And their other loss was a 1-goal loss to Oakland at home, minus Khalif El-Salam. I want to say there was somebody else missing, and Oakland is most likely, because not guaranteed, most likely the 3rd playoff team in that division. So not bad. Not bad. I mean, we just saw what was maybe the floor for Salt Lake, which looks a lot scarier than the worst performance we've seen out of Seattle this year.
But who Seattle played? To our point a second ago about
you can only play who's on your schedule, right? I mean, they play Salt Lake, final game of the season. I think that'll be the one we all have our eyes on, right? Like that'll be, and going into the season and maybe through the first half of the season, we would have said that would have been a real litmus test for where Seattle is. But I think it's going to be a real litmus test for both teams because I think we probably, when I say we, I don't just mean me and you. I think everyone has some questions about where Salt Lake is right now post Jordan Kerr injury. And without Will Selfridge, I hope he's back soon. I don't know what the timetable for him is, but that's going to be a game that I think it tells us a lot about Seattle and a lot about Salt Lake. And I don't know if we're really going to get the answer to who what we really feel about either team until then. I'm really high on Seattle. I'll tell you right now, I am riding super
high. Who isn't high on Seattle right now? Come on.
It's like every week I find more reasons to love them.
They're 35 of 35 in the last 2 weeks on red zone conversions, which is a new kind of stat within the league. They haven't committed more than 19 turnovers in each of their past 6 games. They're absolutely cruising.
They're so fun. They actually didn't huck a ton in this game for them, by their standards. But again,
the past 2 games,
75% complete. But they complete 75% of them.
Well, and to your point, to your point that you've been making over the past few episodes, they have four combined Huck turnovers in the past 2 games. They're not doing the weird volume math of, yeah, it's 75%, but it's 15 to 20, and I'm still turning it over 5 times on a given, Huck attempt.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. Like, Seattle, they check so many of the boxes for me. They have defensive playmakers, right? Khalif El-Salam, Lucas Ambrose each had 3 blocks in this game. They have on offense, obviously, guys like Garrett Martin. Sometimes Khalif goes over. Zeppelin Ronig. Aaron Wolf's playing great. Like, they have Jack Brown's playing. I mean, it just like we talked about this in the preview pod. I feel like we could go down this roster and be like, this person's playing great, this person's playing great, and I'm just like, I love this team. Like, I love watching them. They're so much fun. I just go Seattle, go Seattle.
Here's maybe the stat of the entire season. After the last 3 games where they have converted an astounding 37 breaks against LA, Portland, and Colorado combined, the Seattle Cascades in 2024 currently lead the UFA in breaks per game at 9.5. I talked to you when we were prepping for this show about how likely you would have put Seattle at being in first place in the division. I feel like this is even more of an astronomical sort of achievement for this Cascades team, to be leading the league in breaks per game and to be visibly igniting, I should say, their defensive intensity. I know Daniel Cohen and I talked in 2021 about how they had this sort of Rufio from the Captain Hook movies vibe to their defensive counterattack, then led by Garrett Martin at the time for the Cascades, where they would sort of jailbreak off of turnovers. They would get a transition look and they would just run downhill at opposing offenses. This year they still have that, but they also have the ability, given the roster additions, to sort of have these settle down drives and really punch in break score after break score after break score. Again, they're averaging almost double digits per game for the entire season at this point.
Because they're really good.
I'm
just waiting for this Salt Lake matchup at this point. Like, I'm so excited for it, and I believe I'll get to watch it because I think it's last week of the season on a Saturday, which we don't play on that day. So that'll be popcorn, couch, and getting comfy and watching some good Frisbee. And Seattle's going to take this division. I mean, you can't convince me otherwise until I see it in the standings that they don't, I guess. They have just, it's not just that they look good right now. It's just the consistency with which they've played all year, and also the ways in which I feel like I've seen them level up throughout the season. And yeah, they had some big leads in this game that they let it get close, right? And Colorado's been doing that all year, right? I mean, their win in Salt Lake was Salt Lake having a 4-goal lead going in the 4th quarter, in Colorado
they came back against Madison and Minnesota too. Yep. And they were on the road a couple weeks ago.
This is so, like, you could go the other route and be like, oh, well, they need to find ways. But the other thing is they built that lead. Like, yeah, you would love to see them hold it, but like the fact that they built that lead in the first place, like they never even would have built that lead last year. So like, I get, like, you would like to see a big lead like that turn into a more comfortable win. I don't disagree with that, but like the fact that I think it does say something though, like when you have a big lead and you blow it, we see so many teams lose the game then. It's like once they've lost the lead and it's gotten tied, they're tight and they lose the game, right? Especially a team like where Seattle is right now, where they're transitioning from being a team they have been losers for years, and now they're transitioning into being winners. Like this, if there was a team that's supposed to blow a lead and then once it's blown, lose the game, it's a team that's in Seattle's shoes. They aren't doing that though. Like they they've had games where they've had leads and they've let teams get close. It happened in Oakland where they were up comfortably and only ended up winning by 1. They did that another game, I want to say against LA. They did the same thing too, where they had a comfortable lead and only ended up winning by 1. This was earlier in the season. But again, like teams like this that are making that transition from being perennial losers to trying to become winners, like they lose those games usually when they blow those leads. And Seattle shows the grit and toughness and like the mental capacity to be able to sit there and say, okay, we blew this lead, but this game is still ours, and they go out and take it. And I think that there is a lot to be said about that sort of toughness that a lot of teams don't have.
You make great points for the two things that I want to talk about, which is one of the reasons why I trust Seattle so much going into their matchup against Salt Lake, especially coming out of week 10. The Cascades' confidence. They just have a believability in themselves that I think exceeds almost any team outside of the East. Like they just have, maybe in Atlanta too in the South, but they just have an ability to sort of corroborate and push past some of the, I think, understandable adjustment mistakes that they make, sort of transitioning out of a team that's in the bottom end of the standings from the past 3 seasons into a division leader where they're just still finding themselves in a very real way. But in addition to that, no team has improved their stock more through offseason additions than this Cascades roster. Of their top 5 takeaway leaders, 4 of them are new to the team this year, in Lucas Ambrose, Jasper Dean, a rookie, Mikey O'Brien coming over from Pittsburgh, and Aaron Wolf coming out of Germany. Like, this team has gotten so much production out of the new pieces that it's added. I've mentioned Tommy Lee, excuse me, really bad mistake there. Tommy Lee a couple of times in this episode. You talk about Christian Foster. You talk about, I think, even a player like Derek Murad, who wasn't available in this game. Like, they just continue to get top-end Cedar Hines, Gavin Levy, all these Seattle youth products that they can insert into their lineups. Like, they just get production from everywhere right now. And that is such a problem, I feel like, in the West that can sometimes have their more competitive teams pretty top-end star reliant. Where the Seattle team, like, yeah, they got a great performance from Khalif in this game. Obviously finishes with 4 assists, 3 goals, 3 blocks, and is leading the team in total yardage despite being a defensive starter. But you can list another handful of players beyond that who are completely central to this team's win and getting back to the playoffs. And that's kind of been the storyline in every Cascades win so far this year. Yeah, you can sort of have your highlight player, but there's immediately 4, 5, 6 guys right after that deserve their flowers as well. Well, I do know a topic that you will absolutely have something to respond to, and that's the chaos within the Central Division. I think top line item is Minnesota clinching their 2nd straight regular season division title, a first round playoff bye, and a home field matchup in the divisional title game against a prospective opponent. They get that with another close win over the Union in Chicago, their 2nd of the season. Chicago has battled really valiantly at home against the reigning division champs, but they just haven't really been able to keep an edge. They lose their 2 games by a combined 3 total scores. And while they were pretty efficient in this game against the wind chill, Minnesota still nearly comes up with a 60% defensive conversion rate and just gets blocks when it matters. Noah Hansen most notably coming up with the game-saving block in the waning moments to deny Chicago a potential game-tying score at the end of regulation. And it just speaks, I think, again, as we were kind of talking a second ago about Seattle, about this Minnesota team's depth and its ability to rely on playmakers outside of who we consider to be their stars. Will Brandt obviously had a fantastic game for the offense. You get big plays from Dylan DeClerc throughout the matchup. Colin Berry is just coming on more and more each week. But Minnesota can also rely on some of its newer players, its rookies. Leo Silva Fernandez has another great game. Gordon Larson also stepping up for the offense. Like, this Windshield team is just getting production basically top to bottom in its lineup. And on the flip side, Chicago continues to battle really hardly, very adeptly, but they now fall to 5-4 and are back in this melee sort of circus that, pardon me, you are involved in as well, with Indy, as well as Pittsburgh and Madison, which is just looking like almost going to be a 4-way tie by the end of the season. I wanted to hear your thoughts about both where you think the top end of this division is going, and also kind of where you think this melee that's happening for the second and third seeds is going to end up.
I mean, I think I legally have to say we're going to get the 2 seed, right? Like, I can't. Otherwise, somebody's going to be like, is Cam shaving points over here?
Yeah.
No, I mean, so if you look at the schedules, I mean, because that's kind of where you got to go, right? Like, if you look at the schedules, it probably favors us out of all those teams. Chicago's got to go up to Minnesota. You know, they lost both games at home. You would think that going on the road isn't going to help in that matchup. You know, I think especially this matchup, they had him at home. They had him down Matt Rader, down Quinn Snyder. Like, their two biggest deep threats aren't even there, and you're not able to take advantage, right? So, like, that feels bad. I wouldn't imagine they would have an easier time up in Minnesota. So, like, that's a little unfortunate for Chicago. Like, Pittsburgh's got a game with Philadelphia, which, Philadelphia, for all their struggles this year, has finally started playing some decent ultimate and looks way more competitive than they did early in the season. I definitely don't think that's a gimme by any means for Pittsburgh. I think Philly does look better right now. We just beat Madison, so we're in the driver's seat of that head-to-head right now. We do play them in Madison last game of the season. And I don't know what that's going to decide exactly, but it's going to decide something. Like, I don't know if one of us is already going to be locked into the playoffs, or if neither one of us is, but like, that last week game between us and Madison probably is going, like, that might be the last shoe that drops to kind of decide where everything ends up. So it is, as you said, just chaos. Like, the thing that, like, if you look at the standings right now, is that you have 3 teams with 4 losses and 1 team with 5 losses that are all competing for 2 playoff spots. So I don't know. It's one of those things where there's too many, like, everyone's got the head-to-head against somebody else, and we still have to play Pittsburgh and Madison, and Pittsburgh's got another game with Chicago and Madison, and so it's just, Madison, I think, plays all 3 of us still on their schedule, so it's just like, it's chaos. I mean, you're gonna have to check back next week for an update where we probably still won't know anything.
I wanted to also get to your results against Madison. You guys pull out a close fought 1-goal win after trailing for a majority of the matchup against Madison, 23-22, just 16 total turnovers. Actually had more takeaways than total team turnovers, with 17 blocks. Really impressive. I think just hard fought effort from the Alley Cats at home. And like you say, you sort of edge into a head-to-head advantage against a Radicals team that currently sits a half game above you in the Central Division standings, giving credence to your thoughts about how just chaotic this entire predicament is within the division.
Yeah, and the thing is, they had their 3 Detroit games, which has fed into, obviously, their success, and we've talked about that. We've had a couple. We have another one. We got a doubleheader weekend at Detroit, at Pittsburgh in a couple weeks, and I'm hoping that at that point, if we play well these next 3 games, that we're locked into a playoff seed at that point. But yeah, I mean, Madison, completely different than the last couple games. Kai Marcus, only 2 throwaways compared to the 18 that he had over the last 2 games. Definitely a much more conservative approach from him. And I know that was something Tim DeBile shared with our commentating crew before the game, that was going to be one of the keys to the game for him, was going to be making sure that Kai was being a little bit more, choosy with his decision making. And he certainly was. And had he had a game like he'd had the last couple weeks, I think we would have just run away with this. And I gotta give, we don't talk a lot about the Alley Cats on this podcast. We haven't been one, despite the fact that I'm on here, we have not been, up there with the Atlantas and the Salt Lakes and the New Yorks and some of these other teams that got off to really good starts and have been looking like championship weekend material basically from the get-go, and totally understandable. But I gotta shout out like our D line, man. Like our defense has struggled all year to generate blocks, and even in situations where you feel like maybe we would get a block, like we wouldn't end up with it. And for us to, as you said, have a game where we have more blocks than turnovers, like all those guys have been working really hard to try to like figure out our defensive schemes and like how we're going to do things. And they did an incredible job on Saturday. Like I can't really even just like pinpoint a single person because it was really like such a team effort. I mean, William Wettengel, obviously with the big block at the end, which he had a big block at the end of the 3rd quarter and at the end of the 4th quarter, kind of seal the game. And then shout outs to El Capitan, Lucas Canieres. He was on the honor roll this week for a reason. He had a great game. Xavier Payne had an amazing game. Levi Jacobs had an amazing game. And we just, it was a team performance. So like, we just had so many guys step up. And, Ben Close says, I don't believe ever had 3 blocks in a game. And he had three in that game. So he's a 2nd-year player for us who had like just growing every week. It's been awesome. So like we got off to a slow start this season, and we knew we kind of put ourselves behind the 8 ball with that. So we're hoping that this is kind of the win that launches us into some more success moving forward. So we have a big test. We're going out to Colorado this coming weekend. And, Colorado, we've talked about, despite the fact that their record isn't where we thought it would be, like they're still an incredibly talented team that we're really excited to go play and kind of, like battle test ourselves, right? Like, yeah, they might not make the playoffs, but I don't think you would say that they aren't like a playoff caliber matchup. So we'll see what happens this weekend.
So Indy has 4 remaining games. The other teams that you are vying for playoff contention with in the Central Division each have 3. And as you mentioned, the Summit is your upcoming matchup. So it just figures that if you guys get that win and then kind of set yourselves up for that Week 13 matchup at Madison, that will be the most advantageous position. Whereas putting yourselves at 4 and 5, should you lose at Colorado, would really dampen Indy's playoff chances. But given how the Central has gone so far this season, there's really no telling where it'll end up. You guys, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, there were some conversations that I had with various members of Ultimate Media around what current tie-breaking scenarios would happen. And I just kind of had to hand wave a bit about being like, I don't know, man. My brain doesn't work entirely well in that kind of hypothetical state about what will happen at the end of the season should X, Y, and Z records, because it relies so much on adjusted point differential. If you ever want to look at some of the tiebreaker scenarios, you can on the watchufa.com website. If you go underneath of the standings sub-menu, there is a playoff tiebreaker format. It does need to be expanded upon. Feel like it's a little bit truncated as far as how it lays information out, but it really just communicates, I think, the overall Byzantine nature of deciding this stuff a few weeks out of having actual results to rely upon, because I'm kind of a person who just sits back and waits for somebody to lose.
So we're in Cats are in a good situation where basically our playoff scenarios probably boil down to these two situations. If we win all 4 games, we're very likely the 2 seed. If we lose to Colorado but win all of our Central Division games, we're guaranteed a playoff spot, but don't know which one it would be. So, and for anyone who wants the quick math on that, if we lost to Colorado, won our 3 playoff games, or our 3 Central Division games, we would be 7-5. The best record Madison could have at that point would be 7-5, but we would have the tiebreaker over them. Pittsburgh would have at least 6 losses, if not more, so they would be out of the playoff picture. And then it would just come down to where Chicago ended up if they, were able to get a certain, however they might end up as the 2 seed or the 3 seed potentially, depending on how their rest of their schedule went. But that's kind of where we're at. But, clearly, like, we want to win these 4 games. Like, we want to end on a 5-game winning streak, go into the playoffs as the 2 seed and be able to host that first playoff game because, it's hard to win on the road in the playoffs. We see it every year. Like, home teams do very well in the playoffs. It's not impossible to win as a road team, but it doesn't happen a ton. So we would love to be able to find a way to get that 2 seed. So we gotta take every game right now like it's a playoff game. Like, we got to go out there and do everything we can to win. And I know that's what Chicago and Madison and Pittsburgh are all thinking right now too, because with as tight as things are, it kind of feels like we're in the playoffs already.
I'm really glad after I described being too dumb to do future thinking math, you were like, here's all the playoff scenarios and how they're going to fall out for my team. I know every single iteration of how each of the results will work out, and here's the playoff probability for the Alley Cats going into the final 3 weeks of the regular
There is a
season.
weird situation where we, I guess, wouldn't be the 2 seed if we won all of our games, and that's if Chicago were to, I guess, win their last 3 games. But given the fact that they have to go up to Minnesota, although I say that, and last year they went up to Minnesota with a team far less ready to win that game than this one, and they ended up winning it. So I could be eating my words, but Minnesota's just so tough at home, and they've been playing.
Tell that to Pittsburgh. Tell that to the Thunderbirds.
It's fair. It's fair.
I mean, Thunderbirds have really star-crossed themselves over the past couple of weeks. I mean, they were sitting basically in the driver's position for either the 2nd or 3rd seed in the Central Division, and now with losses at Detroit and then at home to Carolina, it's just going to be a tough uphill battle for them as they get set to face Madison on the road this weekend, in addition to hosting you guys on July 14th, which will be, I think, a very tough matchup for the Thunderbirds, given that I know you all are going to be preparing to avenge the mistakes that you made earlier in the season when you just couldn't get anything going in that matchup. So it will be a very hotly contested Central Division playoff scene. Well, that'll do it for this episode of Swing Pass. The Week 10 recap is concluded. We will tune back in with you in just a couple of days to preview a very heavily anticipated Week 11 slate of games. Cam and I bid you adieu for now. Bye.